Death has been one of the most severe and frustrating consequences in video games for as long as the mediums existed. From getting dysentery on the Oregon Trail to being ruthlessly slaughtered in Bloodborne, I'm sure we've all died our fair share of times throughout our gaming experiences. But is dying really all that bad? Well, I suppose it depends on the game, because depending on how this death mechanic is implemented, it has the potential to teach you so much more about the games you're playing than a tutorial ever could. Or they can be so frustrating or unfair that you barely even want to keep playing. Now, I think it would be pretty low-hanging fruit to complain about why and how dying in a dungeon after not having saved for an hour, and in turn losing all of your progress, or dying to a boss whose difficulty spikes randomly out of nowhere, who has a long, unskippable cutscene leading up to their fight, it wouldn't feel good. So instead, I want to talk about the games that really implement death, game overs, whatever you want to call them, in the right way, and actually make them really useful tools for us to learn and get better at the games that we pour so much of our time into day in and day out. And I think that the perfect example to lead off with is a game that I've personally been playing a lot lately, and that is Celeste. Well, I could talk to an incredible degree about how amazing this game's characters, story, and soundtrack are. The thing that stands out to me more than anything is how well the developers are able to integrate death into the gameplay. When you die in Celeste, all that happens is that there's a quick animation and you are instantly teleported back to the beginning of the screen for you to try again. It doesn't rub it in your face, it doesn't relish in your mistakes, it just lets you try again repeatedly until you're able to successfully accomplish this particular platforming challenge. Essentially, what this game is doing is creating a very smooth and streamlined experience that will inevitably condition you to understand the mechanics, because when it comes down to it, either you succeed or you die. It's as simple as that. If we think of this from a psychological lens, this can be easily explained through B.F. Skinner's idea of operant conditioning. Now, operant conditioning is a way for us to learn in which the decisions we choose to make, also known as our voluntary responses, are controlled by the consequences of these responses. For example, if you have Madeline attempt risky jump, then this will have two very distinct consequences. As we've already mentioned, you either succeed or you fail. This differs from classical conditioning, which tends to focus on our involuntary responses to stimuli. But if we're being honest, this is not unique to Celeste in any way. In most facets of life, it's pretty safe to say that our decisions will have consequences. But it's these consequences that dictate what you do next. Do you try the same jump? Do you try to solve the problem in a new way? Or are you so frustrated that you need to put the game down for a while and come back to it? Really, death, in its simplest form, allows players to learn how to develop a deeper understanding of the gameplay in a game like Celeste. This is because, as Skinner puts it, we tend to repeat the responses that are followed by favorable consequences. If we were to compare Celeste to a game like Super Mario Bros. 3 on the NES, both games that are incredibly well regarded for their gameplay, and ones that I would personally place in my top 5 2D platformers of all time, I think that one major differentiation between the two of them is how they tackle player death. While in Mario you can obtain power-ups that are essentially get out of jail free cards if you get hit, if you do die as Baby Mario though, the game is much less forgiving, taking away one of your lives and placing you firmly back at the beginning of the level. It's not as seamless as Celeste because the punishment for failing a particular segment of a level is a bit more severe, but I would never say that it feels unfair. That is until you get a game over for losing too many of these lives, and then you need to start the entire world over, which, even though this was likely a mechanic introduced used to keep players engaged in a much smaller pool of games available on the Nintendo Entertainment System, this doesn't make the feeling of a game over any less painful. The core difference is how quickly these games allow you to try again. The instant feedback in Celeste is what makes this game such a strong platformer, because in spite of its difficulty, it uses death to teach you more about the game both thematically and in terms of gameplay than you ever would if you had to start from ground zero every time you died. And I think that the developers articulate their ideas and their perspectives on death really eloquently right here.
So teaching is also really relevant to how we arrange the areas in Celeste. This is a level late in the first area. There's these blocks that move when you touch them, and the player has to figure out that they can grab the side of it and like ride it and jump off at the last moment to boost across this gap. This level illustrates our approach to teaching. Obviously, if you just drop the player straight into this level, they would have no idea how to do this and would never get past it. But with Celeste, our goal is to teach implicitly with the level design as much as possible. And the only text we use to teach is the text to tell you the controls at the very start of the game. So the first way we do this is by priming the player. This is the very first time you see one of those blocks. And if you just do the obvious thing and jump off of it, it flings you into these spikes and kills you. So killing the player is the most obvious way to teach people in Celeste because you lose so little when you die. And death is also like so jarring that it forces the player to confront what happened.
Video games are, for all intents and purposes, just reimagined Skinner boxes, and if you're not familiar, a Skinner box is a small enclosure in which the subjects of B.F. Skinner's experiments, typically being mice, are conditioned to have their behaviors modified. If you look at the old experiments, they can be summed up by having the mouse hit a lever in its cage. So let's say the first lever might give it food, and the second could give it a small electric shock through the floor. Over time, this would have the mouse learn that it would get rewarded with food when it hits the first lever, thus reinforcing the behavior, but it will be punished with a shock if it hits the second lever. Dying is the game's equivalent to that electric shock. And in a game like Celeste, the immediacy of being able to try again helps you to learn and progress much more quickly than you would if there was a huge lag time, so that you can commit to muscle memory how to hit that one jump you couldn't get through just right. But let's be honest, while Celeste is a great example of how to do death right, in one way, there isn't all too much gravitas to the mechanic in this setting. So the next game I think we need to talk about is Supergiant's massively successful roguelike dungeon crawler, Hades. Now, just like all roguelike games, Hades does a really great job at making these deaths feel less like a punishment and more of a meaningful part of the game's progression. You're supposed to die, they expect you to, and the game is built around that idea. While yes, there are players who have become so incredibly familiar with the game and are able to beat it without dying once, this certainly isn't the norm. As you play, you'll gather various resources that will help you to get the upgrades you need that will make every subsequent escape attempt from the underworld more personalized and hopefully a little bit easier. While it might hurt to die in a run where you got further than you've ever gotten before, what you get is a lot more valuable than what you lost. While yes, you'll have to start from ground zero and get back to where you were, you are more or less taking one step back and two steps forward. And just like that, you will slowly start to find yourself in something that's known as a core gameplay loop. Death is simply a way for you to cash in on all of the materials you've been collecting throughout your journey through the underworld so that you can try again and again and again. It's not just a mechanic, it's a narrative tool that will help you to unravel the story of the game between deaths. You'll get new interactions with the residents of the underworld until you're finally able to successfully escape. While a game like Persona 5 Royal will slap you in the face for dying just before the end of the boss fight, making you lose all of that progression, in Hades you take your loot and you try again stronger than before. And while it's easy to cherry pick examples and talk about the joys of deaths in these wonderful trial by error experiences, Sometimes the finality and the panic is what makes the experience worthwhile. Like in Fire Emblem, where your unit dies, and if you're playing in classic mode, they're not coming back. They're gone for the rest of your playthrough based on the decisions that you made throughout the course of the game. Or maybe you will actively be punished by the game, with the game literally rewarding whatever killed you by allowing it to gain rank and strength, so that not only are you set back, but it will be even harder to kill that enemy the next time you try. I'm not a game designer, and I'm not gonna pretend like I am one, but in a game, death indicates with pretty absolute certainty the failure on the part of the player to do whatever needs to be done the right way. But the important part isn't the death itself, that's just the consequence. It's what you take from that experience that really allows you to get better at the game. Did you learn how to hit that jump better? Did you learn which 50 ways are the wrong way to do it so that you could eventually get to the right way? Do you know how to deal with a boss's attack patterns now? Have you learned through the loss of a unit that maybe you should be a bit more cautious? It's human nature to never want to fail. We are hardwired to want to succeed, and while never having to run into any difficulties may make things a lot less frustrating at times, it also means that we'll never have an opportunity to learn from our mistakes, or to be able to accept when we do fail. I'm not going to pretend like recognizing why dying in video games will suddenly make us content with picking ourselves up after we fall in our real lives, but I will say that if nothing else, dying in each and every one of these games provides us with an incentive, whether consciously or unconsciously, to improve and keep moving forward. So at the very least, whether it takes 2 tries or 200, eventually we'll manage to make that jump.